Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. Before I go any further, you're not reading it wrong. I haven't uploaded the same video twice, I promise. There are two poems by William Blake called Holy Thursday that are fascinating for us to get into. This time it's coming from a collection called Songs of Innocence and Experience. But because I'm concentrating on this poem that's from the Experience section, I'm calling it Songs of Experience. Before I go any further, I'd like to encourage you to join my tribe and hit subscribe. Let's get into it then, shall we? Well, this poem is a pointed political statement. It's a response poem from the poem that we looked at last time from 1789 called Holy Thursday. And this collection, including the current poem I'm concentrating on here, was published in 1794. The reason for putting alongside innocence with experience is to show the ways in which society is corrupting. Blake is a social critic in this poem, and an adept one at that. He attacks, through his poetic voice, self-interested institutions that seem so powerful, and begs the question, how can such a rich country allow so many people to remain poor? This poem challenges the notions of Britain as great, rich, and civilised. And it's important to note that in the 18th century, specifically towards the end of the 18th century, in the height of the Industrial Revolution, Britain was the global superpower. So Blake calling this land a land of poverty at the end of stanza 1 is radical and frankly rude to those in privileged positions who would believe that Britain was immense. So what's so special about Holy Thursday? I urge you to look down below to see all of the links I have to other Blake poems, but specifically the one I've already concentrated on, because I go into a lot more detail about the power of Ascension Day, the day that it's believed by Christians that Jesus went to heaven. Because this is the day that Blake concentrates on, and this poem is concentrating on children going on a procession that day. And in some ways, these children are the major victims of the profiteering and self-interested institutions that they befall unfortunate consequences because of. But when we're looking at a poem called Holy Thursday, we're forced to ask, how is this holy? It seems just brutal and unfair. And so are we meant to think and ask, has holiness been replaced, or rather misplaced, for hypocrisy? It seems also like religion has totally failed these children. The hymns are shown to be a sham, and the reality is these children are not singing, they're crying. And so Blake's not holding back. He's making it clear. The biblical notion of a rich and fruitful land is being decimated because of the Industrial Revolution caring more about output and where wealth should stay rather than how it is distributed. I urge you now to listen along and read along with me and comment down below on why you think Blake named these poems in exactly the same fashion and what point he's making with this particular poem. Thank you. Enjoy. Is this a holy thing to see in a rich and fruitful land? Babes reduced to misery, fed with cold and usurious hand. Is that trembling cry a song? Can it be a song of joy? And so many children poor? It is a land of poverty. And their sun does never shine, and their fields are bleak and bare, and their ways are filled with thorns. It is eternal winter there. For wherever the sun does shine, and wherever the rain does fall, babe can never hunger there, nor poverty the mind appall. Blake's incredibly clear with the structure of this poem about how the breakdown of order and how that disruption manifests itself has implications. If you look at stanza 1, the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B with 4 stresses in each line, but that breaks down by stanza 2, and that's in part because of the urgency of the questions that have to be asked. There's a mirroring and a critiquing of the established patterns of behaviour. For example, every year these children grow on a procession, every year they go and give thanks. But the shorter lines are a stark contrast to the other Holy Thursday poem. In a sense, the intensity of these shorter lines and the way they pack a punch crystallises the rage that every word seems to carry. The opening stanza is one massive rhetorical question that definitely fuels our concern, if not our anger. It's the cynical tone, as well, of the rhetorical question. When the opening line is this a holy thing to see? It proves that religion is just a spectacle. It's all about how it looks for these children to go into the church, proceeding in a polite, punctual, and, dare I say it, clipped fashion. The reference in line 2 to a rich and fruitful land has biblical connotations of fertility. And the idea that you should be allowing for nature to take its course is echoed also as a romantic fascination, the awe of nature. But in many ways, line 3 affirms what's already our fear. There are babes reduced to misery. And that word, babe, heightens their vulnerability. Equally, the verb reduced shows that poverty completely depletes a child's opportunity to thrive. They're in misery. It can't get more bleak than that. It's the fascinating contrast between the wealthy and those who are left in misery. And it seems like there's a distinct irony between the semantic field of nurturing that we meet in line 2 of what should be happening amongst the wealthy, distributing that rich and the fruits of whatever they have. But instead, we're told these babes are fed with a cold and usurious hand. And usurious is when, if you like, you gain more because you give a little. To give you the more precise definition, it's when you lend money for profit. So you add interest. Today we'd call people who do that loan sharks, or giving a loan with interest. But it critiques, really, the idea that you, as the wealthy, are forcing the poor to suffer further. They suffer further because you are pretending and suggesting that you're feeding them, but in actual fact, they have to pay for what you give them, and they suffer more accordingly. And it's definitely this contrast between the rich and the fruitful, the being fed, and the idea of a hand that feeds you, in contrast to cold, usurious, misery, and babes, which seems so dark and sinister and lost. And it's interesting for us to put this into the context. This is the lack of care being flagged for poor children. And we know that charity schools in this time were creating workers for brutal industries, that these children created profits for employers, and yet many thousands of these children died young and no one really did much about it. And so once again, Blake is reaffirming what we know the Romantics care about. That children should be free, not condemned to work. That children should be free, not reduced to misery. And this doesn't go away. The question that lingers in stanza 1 moves on to an intense bombardment of questions in stanza 2. This time, we're referring back to these children singing in the church. And the poetic voice is saying, that song that sounded so blissful in the Songs of Innocence poem now sounds so traumatic that it's a trembling cry. So it's mistaken for crying, not a song. And this second stanza is loading up the brutality of this scene. And the rhetorical questions add even more of our awareness to what is going wrong in this superficial scene of peace and piety. By line 7, and so many children poor. It's this sense that it's unfathomable that we would care about singing and the power of a song which we associate with freedom when these children are so incredibly unlucky to not be held and supported and allowed to flourish. Line 8 is a statement. I think that's fascinating. We got all this bombardment of rhetorical questions and then we get a statement. It is a land of poverty! Exclamation mark. So we get the height of the emotional intensity here, affirming that Britain is distracted by profit rather than the principles that Jesus was advocating for caring for the weak. And it's interesting and ironic for us today to recognise that Blake is referenced in patriotic events with a poem of his that's now called as a song Jerusalem. He's ashamed of British priorities here. He's disgusted that as a global power for industrial output, Britain's priorities do not live with serving the poor. So these are quite damning experiences that are being shared. And I suspect that the Songs of Innocence and Experience affirms the corruption inflicted on the vulnerable by those with enough power to know better. But it doesn't end there. So as this critique of society and where power lives unpacks and unfolds itself, the commentary is equally mirrored by the complete breakdown of our rhyme scheme, which now in stanza 3 moves from A, B in our stanza 1 to C, D, E, D. And then in stanza 4, when we get to it, C, F, D, F. So really, it's a complete eruption, an upheaval of the status quo, much like what our commentator is trying to do with values as a whole. And to wed that idea and wedge it even tighter together, we have the anaphoric repetition of and there across stanza 3. In lines 9, 10 and 11. And their sun, and their fields, and their ways. It accentuates that lack of hope for these children. That common association of the sun and what it represents as hope when it shines is disastrously dashed as an opportunity for these children, because the sun never shines. Their existence is seen to be futile, and never in particular affirms their suffering. And of course, stanza 3 is loaded with the awe of nature. And the imagery reiterates that. It's a romantic notion that we will meet again and again. I think there's also something quite powerful about these alliterative sounds that litter stanza 3, whether it's the sun that shines, whether it's the bleak and bare, whether it's the fields filled. Each of these alliterative sounds stress the drudgery of their existence, and their existence being the children's existence, that repeated nature of the mundane, because it's not filled with joy. In particular, line 9, their ways are filled with thorns. Now, this could refer to Christ's own sufferings. We know Blake was a Christian, but we also know he's critical of religion, not of spirituality and faith. So more fascinated by the superficiality rather of ritual rather than the mechanics of how one can have our own deeper faith. I'm fascinated by line 12. It is eternal winter there. There is distant from here, and the pathetic fallacy that we get of winter that's forever, it's eternal. There's a kind of pathetic fallacy overhanging all of this about what the conditions are. These children are forever trapped in poverty. And the use of present tense in the third stanza builds on our frustrations at this point. This is an ongoing struggle. It doesn't go away, but it's distant from where we are here because it's there. And then, as if that weren't enough, our final stanza, it shifts and subverts our whole gaze and attention, and it's now redefining prosperity completely. We're being reminded that wherever the sun does shine, wherever the rain does fall, we're reminded of the facts and the truth of nature, if you like, its own virtue, because it's when the sun shines and the rain falls that things can grow. And we need things to grow for us to get food to sustain life. Yet, to go back to line 15, babe can never hunger there, you see, because things will grow. There's no usurious hand that's giving them something that's toxic deep down for them. And we're encountering more and more what suffering truly means in our hearts, not just in how others are living. Blake is forcing us to consider what it feels like in your mind as a poor person. The psychological impacts of poverty are acknowledged in his final line, because in heaven, as is the allusion in this stanza, children are not hungry, and their poverty doesn't even affect how they feel. So heaven, it would seem to me that Blake is suggesting it's only heaven that can give the poorest people space to have their needs met, which is incredibly damning for prosperous Britain at the peak and height of the Industrial Revolution. That image of never being hungry, and revisiting the image of that helpless babe from stanza 1, it acknowledges that there should be opportunities for all people's hunger to be met, their basic needs to be satisfied. But equally, a helpless babe, that is another image that reminds me of the vulnerable Christ. I suspect that Blake's anger is not with God. I suspect it's with the misuse of what Christian values look like because of people on earth. That final line, nor poverty the mind appall, is particularly pertinent when we look at the word poverty, because it's being juxtaposed in that stanza around all these lush conditions for life to flourish. That we need the sun, we need the rain, and that way no one can hunger. Yet poverty is the heart of this poem's struggle. It's forcing us as readers to consider the vulnerable more. And it's similar to the other Holy Thursday poem, which signals at the end an imperative mood that we need to look out for the vulnerable. But here, it's not imperative, it's far more emotive. That we need to acknowledge that shows of thanks to God made by those that suffer far more do not help our situation. Instead, that we need to acknowledge that the most fragile in society need to be looked at, not that we should choose to look away from wherever they have struggles. And instead of forcing them to look up to God, we should look across to them and help them. Quite a simple message, but profoundly stated, considering that he's describing in one poem the procession in detail, and here we're getting a sense of how humanity and experience is corrupting that opportunity. So link down below with any comments that you have about what Blake's doing. Why not subscribe to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar for all things English, literary and grammatical?